Hey guys, Nathan here, Absurd Being, Kierkegaard. We are at video 14, I think, if my math is correct. So let's have a look at the diagram and see what we are looking at today. So you can see there in the middle, we're at the finishing up this kind of with the section I've color-coded brown. So we'll be looking at melancholy, despair, and offence. Despair is by far the biggest part of the video today, but yeah, we'll finish up that section today, and then we'll move on to something different. We're coming to the end there, that bottom right corner. We're honing in on that, so we'll yeah, that's what we're going to look at. That's what we're going to look at today. Okay, so let's have a look at the first topic, which is melancholy. So I don't have a whole lot of things to say about melancholy. In either or, Kierkegaard talks about this as being an affliction of the aesthete. So it's something that melancholy is something that someone who's in that aesthetic sphere can be afflicted with, and it occurs when an immediate individual tries to lift their life above the earthly to achieve eternal validity. And if this fails, or really when this fails, melancholy results. So it's an attempt by an individual in the aesthetic realm to kind of pull themselves up above that realm without actually going through without really getting into the ethical. So while still kind of remaining an aesthete, while still remaining an aesthete, trying to kind of lift yourself up without actually doing any of the hard work, without actually having changed anything fundamental. And so melancholy is different from sorrow in the sense that melancholy lacks a definite worldly object. So it's not about, one isn't melancholic about a thing in the world, a finite worldly object. One is melancholic about one's kind of situation. There's no definite object that one is melancholic over. And that's what distinguishes it from sorrow, Kierkegaard says. And so this is also parallels the idea of anxiety and fear, the way that anxiety was also not directed at a worldly finite object, the way that fear is. And that's basically melancholy there. It's very... I've only got a little amount to say about it. So yeah, I'm going to finish with melancholy there and move into despair. So despair, we talk a lot about despair in either or and also in the sickness unto death. So I'll start with either or first. And in either or, Kierkegaard talks about the way that despair characterizes, again, in the same way that we saw with melancholy, it characterizes the immediate life. So someone in that aesthetic sphere, and arises when a goal fails to deliver the happiness that it promised. And when that happens, so you're striving for a goal, you've got a worldly finite goal in mind, you're striving for it, and you get it, but it doesn't satisfy you the way that you expected, the way that you thought it was going to. So the goal then is seen to have been transitory and unfulfilling. So you kind of see the goal for really what it was. And the point here is that the goal hasn't changed. The goal is the same. You achieve the goal and you're unfulfilled. But the goal hasn't changed. So the goal that is now unfulfilling, that is now transitory, it's now seen by you as being transitory and unfulfilling, was always actually transitory and unfulfilling. So you just, you were kind of, you had the wrong idea about what this goal really was. So despair is like this recognition that these types of goals, these finite worldly goals, are ultimately unfulfilling. And what it means then is that actually you were always in despair, even though you didn't know it. You were always in despair because you were always chasing these finite worldly goals. Remember, the goals haven't changed. It's just when you achieve them, you realize they don't deliver the happiness that you thought they would. And then you can kind of see these goals for what they really are, which is they're all transitory and unfulfilling. And it means that you were always in despair because you were always chasing these types of goals. But you just didn't realize that you were in despair. So in this way, every aesthetic view on life turns out to be despair because it's built on what may or may not be. It's built on the transitory. It's built on the ephemeral, the fleeting, these are just synonyms, the unfulfilling, fundamentally unfulfilling. And so it's necessarily a life view with its condition outside oneself. So it's because you're looking for your kind of completion outside you, rather than turning inward, which is, remember, an important theme for Kierkegaard. So that's what despair is. It's good. It turns out to be good, Kierkegaard says, because it signals that one is ready to transition out of the aesthetic sphere to something absolute and eternal, or as Kierkegaard would say, to life. So it indicates that you're willing to, or you're ready to move into one of those different, a higher sphere, the ethical or the religious. So although it doesn't feel good, it doesn't sound good to be in despair, it's kind of an indication, a positive indication. And it differs from doubt because doubt is a despair of thought. So it's related to kind of cognition and intellect, whereas despair is what Kierkegaard says, a doubt of personality. So it's kind of more less intellectual, less analytic, more going right to the heart of who you are, kind of strikes a deeper chord, I guess you could say. So that's how Kierkegaard talks about despair in either or. And he talks about it in a bit more detail, I think, in The Sickness Unto Death. But I think the two accounts, although they're not entirely the same, I think they do kind of dovetail together reasonably nicely. So what does he say about despair in The Sickness Unto Death? Well, despair is an imbalance in the self. And remember that the self was a relation which relates to itself, and in relating to itself relates to something else, that something else being God. So it's a despair in the self, and it's an imbalance in the self, and the specific type of imbalance is one in which the self wants to be rid of itself. So that's an interesting idea. And what exactly is that? What is that? It's dissatisfied. The self is dissatisfied with itself. I'll come back to that in a moment, will I? No. Let me hit that right now, I think. So despair is, it's always over the self. That's the first important point. That despair is always about the self. It appears to be about something else, something external, but in fact, it always concerns the self, Kierkegaard says, and specifically wanting to be rid of that self. So let me flesh out what this means. Kierkegaard gives an example in The Sickness Unto Death of someone wanting to be Caesar in, I guess, Rome. And the individual failing to become Caesar, and then despairing over the self which didn't become Caesar, which failed in this task, in this object, in this objective. And so what the individual wants then is to be rid of the self that failed to become Caesar. It wants to be a different self. And that it's that which defines despair. It's this dissatisfaction with who one is fundamentally. But on the other hand, even if the individual did become Caesar, he would still be in despair, Kierkegaard says, because he would want to be his self despairingly. And by that, he means that the individual would want to be his self in the way that he wants to be it, i.e., without any reference to God. So he wants to be the self that he is, the Caesar. He's achieved his goal. He's become Caesar. He wants to be that self on his own. He wants to be who he is without this reference to God. And yet that is what the self is for Kierkegaard. It's that relation which relates to itself, and in relating to itself relates to God as well. And so in wanting to be oneself despairingly, one wants to be who one is without this acknowledgement of God. So either way, whether you achieve your goal or whether you don't, you're still in despair. And that kind of, it's kind of a different way of thinking about the way that we talked about the way that we talked about despair in just a few moments ago in either or. So I think they kind of complement each other, actually, I think, these two descriptions. So there are two formulations then of despair. Not wanting to be oneself, which is a form of weakness, Kierkegaard thinks, and also wanting in despair to be oneself, which is defiance. And you can see how Kierkegaard arrives at those kind of at that description. But the latter, that wanting in despair to be oneself, that always relates back to the former. Sorry, it always reduces to the former. So originally the fundamental motivation for despair is always not wanting to be the self that one is. Okay, so the imbalance here that we're talking about, despair, which is this imbalance in the self, doesn't come from the relation itself. It doesn't come from the relation which relates to itself. It doesn't come from that self or that synthesis, or else despair would be an unavoidable part of human nature. It would just be a part of what it means to be human, would be to be in despair. But Kierkegaard doesn't think that. Rather, it comes from the relation to the something else the relation relates to, which is God. So despair arises from the fact that we are related to God. And essentially it comes from the denial or the rejection of this fact. So this in turn means that despair is not self-perpetuating, which means it must be brought about at every moment by the individual, which is an interesting kind of addition to make there. I think it's not a part of what it means to be human. It's not kind of existential in that sense. It's something we have to continually kind of cause. We have to bring it about in our being. So it's essential, however. So we talked about the way that in either or despair was good, and that it indicates one's ready to move into a higher sphere. Well, it's essential in the sickness unto death. Kierkegaard talks about it being essential because coming into a relationship with God can never happen unless one goes through despair. So it's kind of analogous to sin consciousness in that way. One has to go through it first in order to win that relationship with God. Maybe that's not the right word. In order to come into that relationship with God. So again, it's kind of an indication that one is kind of making progress. Yeah. So that's despair. Why does he call it actually the sickness unto death? It is the sickness unto death. It's what the title of that book refers to, despair. And I'll just mention this quickly. It's not the reason he calls it the sickness unto death. It's not just a sickness that will kill us. It's not a sickness that will he doesn't mean that when he says sickness unto death. He means that we're actually unable to die, but also bereft of the hope of life. That's what despair means. It's not about being so kind of ill or sick that you'll be killed from it, you'll die from it. It's that one is unable to die, but at the same time bereft of the hope of life. So it's a real kind of it's a terrible existence, I guess, is the idea that Kierkegaard's pushing here. It's the hopelessness of not even being able to die. And it's because despair concerns the self, and the self for Kierkegaard is eternal. So that's I think that's everything I have to say there about despair. So hopefully that's clear. Let's move on to offence. All right, so in offence, well, perhaps in religiousness A, let me just take it back first. Religiousness A, in religiousness A, offence isn't possible. And this is because in religiousness A, everything is immanent. Religiousness A is entirely within immanence. Remember, in religiousness A, the individual is dialectically defined inwardly in self-annihilation before God. And so there's no transcendence, there's no genuine movement there. So offence isn't possible, Kierkegaard says. However, in religiousness B, offence arises because it's built on a paradox. Religiousness B is fundamentally that paradox which requires faith against the understanding. So it's specifically this idea of faith which is deliberately, directly opposing the understanding. And it's that causes offence. It's that which is offensive in Christianity. In Philosophical Crumbs, Kierkegaard talks about the way that offence. I guess when we're talking about offence, he means people being offended by Christianity, being offended by this idea that the eternal has kind of appeared at a moment in time in Christ. So Christianity can arouse this offense. It's offensive to people, this idea that the eternal could have come about in time. And he's exploring why Christianity arouses this feeling of offense in people. And in Philosophical Crumbs, he talks about the way that offense claims that the moment, which is Kierkegaard has a technical definition of, which we'll look at in a couple of videos later. But for now, the moment is basically a temporal point which has decisive, infinite importance for the individual. So that's what the moment is. And offense claims that the moment is foolishness, that this paradox, which the Christian is espousing, is foolishness, is ridiculous. How can a moment in time have decisive, infinite importance? It doesn't make sense. How can the infinite, the eternal, appear at a moment in time, at a specific moment in time? The infinite appearing in the finite, it's ridiculous. But Kierkegaard says this claim that the moment is foolishness, the paradox is foolishness, is simply the claim of the paradox. That's what the paradox is. It's just the paradox repackaged. Because the paradox basically says that the understanding is absurd. The understanding is not going to get us to where we want to go here. We have to go beyond the intellectual, beyond the analytical, beyond understanding. And so offense, when people take offense at Christianity, religiousness be, and say, this is ridiculous, the moment, this temporal point which has decisive, infinite importance, doesn't make sense. When they say that, all they're saying is that they're making the same claim that Christianity is making, which is the claim of the paradox, the paradoxical claim. But that's what Christianity says anyway. So it's not really an argument here against religiousness be. Offense isn't an argument against Christianity. Hopefully that makes sense. I feel like I made a bit of a hash out of that. Also in the Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard talks about the way that Christianity is offensive because it's so severe, and it holds human beings to extraordinary standards. But that's just the way it is for Kierkegaard. Christianity, religion, it's not something easy, he says. It's not something which is, you're going to make the decision to believe, to have faith, and then everything's going to be smooth from there, smooth sailing from there on out. It's a difficult path, and Kierkegaard wants to stress that, but that this is not an objection to Christianity for Kierkegaard. Yes, it is severe. Yes, this is offensive. Yes, you can take offense at it, but that's just the way it is. And he ends up saying in the Sickness Unto Death that offense is actually unhappy admiration. There is a sense of admiration behind this offense that people take, behind this offensiveness that people can read into religiousness be or Christianity. I just want to finish up with a little bit about the pain of sympathy, which we have, I've mentioned briefly before. I mentioned it in the video, the fourth video I did on the 3 spheres of existence. And so we'll just have a quick look at this idea of sympathy and what Kierkegaard calls the pain of sympathy. So sympathy arises, the pain of sympathy arises in religiousness be, and that's because, as we saw back in that video, the believer is unable to sympathize with every human being, but essentially only with Christians. So the believer is only able to sympathize with Christians, with other Christians. And this is because, which I explained in that earlier video, that Christianity or religiousness B binds one to the absolute telos absolutely. So it's naturally isolating, individuating. It naturally pulls you out. So whereas in religiousness A, one can, because it's immanent, because there's no transcendence there, there's no transcendent movement, one can have sympathy for everybody else, for everybody. But in religiousness B, there's this isolating aspect to it, dimension to it, and the fact that it binds you to it, it binds you to the absolute telos absolutely. It's kind of like there's no half measure, you have to, you're all in, and that being all in separates you from other people who aren't all in. And so this is painful for Kierkegaard. He's talking here about this painful aspect of sympathy, where you're unable to kind of relate to, in a way, sympathize with other people, and this results in a situation where it's almost as if one hates one's mother and father, one's family, if they're not Christian. So, and this is, I think I mentioned this in the earlier video too. He's talking about that line. I think Jesus said it. He came to separate children from their parents or something, sons from fathers, mothers from daughters, something like that. So I think so he's referring to this. Why did that? Why did Jesus say that? Well, it's because religiousness B is isolating. It by virtue of what it is, it singles one out. It means that you can't any longer have sympathy for all people, only for other Christians. So it's as if you hate your family. It's as if you hate people who aren't Christians, even though you don't really. But this idea of that you're unable to sympathize with them anymore kind of makes it appear as if it's that extreme. So in Religiousness B, like I say, Christians are absolutely separated from non-Christians. And it's not about hating them, but it's the way it appears. It's as if they hate them. Okay, so that is where I'm going to wrap up today. Let's have a quick look at a summary. Okay, so first of all, we looked at melancholy, and we saw that this occurs when an immediate individual tries to rise above the immediate without actually entering the ethical or the religious, but staying in the immediate, the aesthetic sphere, tries to kind of lift themselves up and focus on something eternal, something more. And what results is melancholy. It's different from sorrow, which is always over a worldly, finite object. Then we looked at despair, which characterizes, again, the aesthetic life view. And and we saw that the aesthetic individual is actually always in despair. So one is, by virtue of being in the aesthetic realm, one is always in despair. And in the sickness unto death, we saw it is described as an imbalance in the self, in which the self wants to be rid of itself. And there were two formulations: not wanting to be oneself, not wanting to be the self that one is, that is in that relationship with God, which was weakness, and wanting to be oneself despairingly, which is defiance, wanting to be oneself on one's own, without that relation to God. And then we looked at offence, and we saw this only arises in religiousness B, and it arises because of that paradox, because it's paradoxical at its core. And Kierkegaard spins this as being a form of unhappy admiration. So still kind of a positive for Christianity. Okay, so that's where we are today. I'm going to finish there. Like I say, we're approaching the home straight. This has taken a long time to get here. I'm unable to do more than really one video a week, so it's just kind of slow going, but thanks for sticking with me. I hope this has clarified a couple of things for you, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks again.